So when we're graphing quadratics, excuse me, not graphing, but factoring, we quickly see how we have a pair of binomials here, and if you use FOIL, x times x is x squared, 3 times x and 2 times x add up to 5x, and lastly 3 times 2 is 6. So going in this direction is never very complicated. Essentially, it's just double distribution. However, going in this direction is a little bit more complicated. One method that we know of is simply just to guess and check. We have to find factors of this 6 that add to this 5, and we try a bunch of things until we get the right one. Well, that's going to be the case. There will always be some guess and check, but let me show you the method called something special, Snowflake method. Snowflake method looks like this. What you're always going to do is take your A times your C. So here's your A, which is 1, and you're going to multiply it by your C, which is positive 6. So in this case, 6 goes on the top there. Next, B goes on the bottom. So there's my 5. B goes on the bottom. And another component is just this coefficient right here and one of the x's. So a 1x goes here and a 1x goes here. So this is the setup. Now the thing to remember, what is going to go into the wings right here is that we have to find the factors of 6 that add to 5. The factors of 6 that add to 5. In other words, these two will multiply to a 6. And these two will add to a 5. So take, for example, if I were just to try something real quick. Notice that 6 plus 1 does not give me 5, so that wouldn't work. But 3 plus 2, which are the factors, 3 times 2 is 6, 3 plus 2 is 5. Now here's the magic of the snowflake method, is here's one of your factors right there, x plus 3, and we put plus there because it's a positive 3, and here's the other one, x plus 2. There we go. So how do we complicate things? Well, let's try a different one, and still with the coefficient of 1 right here. So how do we factor x squared minus x minus 12? So set up my snowflake, and I'm going to do negative 12, because negative 12 times a 1. Next, this one right here is just a 1x and a 1x. It might seem superfluous right now to do that 1 right there, but later when there's a non-1 as a leading coefficient, we're going to see that's important. Next, the b goes on the bottom, so that's a negative 1. So I find the two numbers that multiply to a negative 12 and add to a negative 1. Well, one of them has to be a negative, so clearly negative there and positive here. And if you work through it fairly quick, it's negative 4 times 3 is negative 12, and negative 4 plus 3 is this. You could have tried a couple other things like a 2 and a 6, but those don't sum to the right thing. So there's some guess and check involved here. So this is one of your factors, x minus 4, and this is the other one of your factors, x plus 3. So how does this work with even more complicated? So watch the magic. So we have here 2x squared minus x minus 21. And we want to factor this. So I make my snowflake. This time I'm going to say 2 times negative 21. So now I put a negative 42 on the top. And again, just by coincidence, a negative 1 there. Now, don't forget, I'm going to take the 2x and put that in the upper part of the wings. And now we have to say, well, what are my factors of negative 42 that sum to a negative 1? And sometimes it would be helpful to make a small little T-chart like this that looks like this. So negative 21 and 2, and negative 14 and 3, and negative 7 and 6. And notice that all of these, you could just flip the negative to the other side. And when we look at this, the only pair that add up to a negative 1 are these. So negative 7 and positive 6. Now here's the kicker. What we have to do, we're not just going to jump to this and say these are the factors necessarily. What we have to do is treat each of these like a fraction. And if the fraction can be reduced, we do. So notice this cannot be reduced. So 2x minus 7 is one of the factors. However, this can be reduced if I divide by 2. So I get x there and a 3 there. So there's my other factor, x plus 3. So let's practice another one. So one key thing that you should always consider is before we even try to snowflake factor or factor the whole trinomial, or binomial if it's only 2, is that you should always double check to see if you can factor out a GCF. And notice that with this one here, each of these are divisible by 3. So when I factor out a 3, my new trinomial inside looks like so, plus a 4. So now, effectively, what I'm going to do is just ignore the 3, and I'm going to do snowflake just for this trinomial here. So I put 4 there, 5 there, 1x there, 1x there, and I look for the two numbers that multiply to 4 but add to 5. And if we think hard and long, we see quickly that it's just a 4 and a 1. So x plus 4 is here, and x plus 1 is there. And don't forget to bring down that 3, and this is now called factored completely. Now, lest you think that's only as complicated as it gets, let's try another situation. So in this one, I'm going to see if there's a common factor here that I can pull out, and 3, and I can't divide this by 3, so I'm not going to, there is no GCF besides 1. So no GCF, so I can now start my snowflake. And if I start the snowflake, notice things get a little bit complicated fairly quickly, because 3 times negative 24 is negative 72. And b goes on the bottom, so the negative 14 goes there, and I'm going to put the 3x in the upper wings. Now, here's where it gets complicated, is that there are a lot of factors of 72, and we have to pinpoint it down to the pair that sum to negative 14. So it might take a little bit of work to do. So I'm just going to start listing the factors and see what I come up with. Now, since the two numbers are going to add to a negative, that means the larger looking one is going to be a negative. So here is a pair. Next, negative 36 and 2, those sum to negative 32, not quite. So negative 24 and 3, I'm getting closer, but not quite. So let me try another. So negative 12 and 6, negative 9 and 8, and I start thinking to myself, wait a tick, did I miss something? Because none of these add to negative 14 if we start looking here. Negative 21 is here. This is negative 6, so there's got to be something else in there. So I just see all the different factors that I have or do not have. Notice I don't have a 4 in there, so I could use some sort of a 4 as well. And finally, I get negative 18 and 4. So at this point in time, I almost exhausted all my options here, and I finally got it. It could take a long time to do this. But notice that since it adds to a larger number, try to avoid the ones that are close to the square root, and probably the 1 and the whatever the number, probably to avoid. So notice I could have just started with there and only done 4 instead of the 6 in the end. So now, what do? I'm going to place these two here and here, and it never, ever matters in the history of the universe which one goes where. So I'm just going to put the 4 here. I'm just going to put the negative 18. But I do have to consider which of these can be reduced. This one cannot be reduced as a fraction, so I just write that as a factor. And this one over here can be, so x and negative 6. So x minus 6. And just to do a quick FOIL check, 3x times x is 3x squared. 4 times negative 6 is negative 24. And then the OI part of FOIL looks like it does indeed add there. So good to go, circle. So sometimes it will take a little bit of effort, and sometimes the snowflake will be super quick. But just remember, put AC on the top, B on the bottom, and then the AX and AX always here. And then what happens with this is that these two have to add down below, and they have to multiply above. So good luck and Godspeed to you.